I call Julianne Ginter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak on the third reading of the Construction Contracts Amendment Bill. I'm very pleased to say that this is one example during my time here in this Parliament where I've seen submissions to the Select Committee, persistence on the part of the affected people who were showing up and submitting and calling for change because there was a problem that needed to be dealt with. And of course, the role of opposition parties as well, championing the issue. And a number of other circumstances have actually, all of those factors have actually contributed to an improvement to the law that's going to make a real difference in the lives of many independent business owners who work as subbies out there, working on the ground, helping construct our buildings, whether they be residential, commercial, industrial. I just want to go through the history of this bill because, we've heard different sides of it from different people in this House. In 2009, the government undertook a review of the Building Act. And in 2010, that led to a review of the Construction Contracts Act itself. And there were 5 areas that were identified as needing change, but only 3 of them actually came forward in the initial bill that was put to the House. So there were 2 areas identified during the review that were not dealt with in the legislation when it came to the House in its first reading. And that were the issues of security of payments and retentions. And we all knew this was a significant issue. Certainly people in the industry knew it was a significant issue. And yet the government was choosing not to deal with it when they actually went to amend the Construction Contracts Act, probably putting it in the too hard basket, or potentially because they have some constituents or big donors who are principal contractors who would not like the law to be changed to actually level the playing field for subcontractors. So finally, the government introduced a bill in 2013. So that's 2.5 years ago. It did not deal with the issue of retentions or security of payment. But then in February 2013, we had the Mainzeal collapse, which many people have referred to today. And of course, as it eventuated, when Mainzeal went into receivership, it owed over $18 million to subcontractors for work that had been undertaken and was never going to be able to be paid for. And that money was completely unsecured. So we had guys out there who are doing their best. They weren't even able to access their tools on the day, which sometimes got locked onto sites because the receivers were, it was the receivers who were locking them out. And they lost $18 million collectively, and that money was not secured at all. That was twice the amount that Mainzeal owed to the Bank of New Zealand. They owed $9.3 million, and of course that money was secured. So the Mainzeal collapse demonstrated just how much the law was failing the subbies, and it was allowing principal contractors to use money that technically did not belong to them as cash flow for other projects rather than going to the bank, which was irresponsible and really immoral. So the problem was so huge with Mainzeal that it was impossible for the government to completely ignore it. And when the bill came to the Select Committee in July 2013, which was more than 2 years ago, although we had politicians all saying they were very sympathetic with the subcontractor situation, they wanted to do something about it, ultimately it was out of the scope of the bill that was actually going to amend the Construction Contracts Act. But during the submissions process, we heard from a huge number of submitters, and more than a dozen of them were specifically focused on this problem of retentions and the lack of security of payments. We heard from the Building Disputes Tribunal, the Building Industry Federation, the Construction Strategy Group, the New Zealand Contractors Federation, the Law Society, the Specialist Trade Contractors Federation, Steel Construction New Zealand, Master Plumbers, Gas Fitters and Drain Layers, the Electrical Contractors Association, and on and on and on. And we heard over and over again that this was a major problem that was costing potentially tens of millions of dollars to subcontractors, and money that was legally should have been theirs, but was being spent by principals and was not able to be recovered and was completely unsecured and not protected by the law. And so they're saying we have this huge problem, they're begging us to solve it. And unfortunately, well, or fortunately, as the case may be, The minister at the time, Maurice Williamson, was not interested in dealing with this problem in this legislation. So it came back to the House with SOPs from the government in March 2014. That's over 18 months ago now. And there was no indication that the issue of retentions or security payments was going to be dealt with. And there was an issue of build law put out by the Building Disputes Tribunal, who noted that this major problem wasn't being dealt with in the legislation. And they noted that the Labour Party MP, Clayton Cosgrove, had put forward an SOP modeled on some legislation in New South Wales, I believe, which deemed that, at least for the purposes of commercial and industrial buildings, that retention should be held in trust. But they criticized Clayton Cosgrove's SOP in the build law issue because there were a couple of problems with it. One, it was requiring that a separate trust account be set up, which is the industry thought was going to create a lot of compliance costs. And secondly, and probably more problematically, it only applied to commercial and industrial projects, not residential. We saw the legislation from the research from Brands during the Select Committee submissions demonstrated that a majority of the payments that were being withheld that subcontractors were not able to access were actually on residential projects. So I spoke in depth with the New Zealand Contractors Federation, and they really need to be congratulated for all the work that they did on it, because we worked together and proposed an SOP that would deem that it was very, very simple. It worked with the existing language in the existing bill, and it would deem that retentions must be held in trust, didn't require a particular trust account being set up, but it did allow for protection of that money through the legislation, and it would have applied to all contracts, whether they be commercial, industrial, or residential. And Build Law, the Building Disputes Tribunal, applauded me for that SOP, although I couldn't have done it without listening to the expertise of the guys who really know what's going on the ground. They were the ones who really worked to propose that elegant solution, which finally is going to be included in the legislation that's going to be passed today. And the Green Party is very happy to see that finally this problem is going to be dealt with. But it took a lot. I mean, it took members of the industry coming to the Select Committee. It took Mingseel collapsing and leaving $18 million in debt to subcontractors. So it took a lot of persistence on the part of the affected people. It took opposition parties effectively coming up with alternative solutions and putting pressure on the government in the House. I tabled my SOP in May of 2014. We questioned the minister in May of 2014. And finally, because the minister, Maurice Williamson, ended up resigning in May 2014, and we got a new minister of Buildings and Construction, Minister Nick Smith. He actually listened to the affected people in the industry in a way that it seems Maurice Williamson was unwilling to do so. And so I think we do have to thank circumstances that the bill that was the government SOPs that were introduced in March 2014 were withdrawn and do not exist in the legislation today. Instead, we have government SOPs which are very closely related to the one that I tabled in May 2014, was finally introduced 18 months after it was supposed to come to committee of the whole House in a whole other parliament. The government tabled their SOP in September of this year. It deems that the retention should be held in trust. There's a lot more detail in it because they've had the officials work it out. And so finally, we're going to see an improved bill after, let's see, I guess if this started in 2009, we're looking at a 7-year process to see what is right and moral, which is protection for subcontractors' money, which should belong to them, which should not be spent by principals as cash flow on other projects, is finally going to get protection in the law today. And I'm very proud as an opposition member to say this is probably, it's hard to see what good you're doing when you're in opposition, but I do feel like this is one of the biggest wins, sir, that I've had since I've been in Parliament. So thank you. The Green Party will be supporting this bill.